Imagine walking into a diner just to have dinner with a friend, and suddenly 10 men surround your table. They laugh at you, call you trash, and tell you this is a white table and that you don't belong. The room goes silent. No one helps. Everyone just watches, waiting to see you crawl out the door. But what none of them know is that the woman they're threatening isn't ordinary at all. She's a decorated U.S. Marine. And when she finally stands, what happens next will leave the entire diner in stunned silence. The diner smelled of coffee and grease, the kind of place where the vinyl booths cracked from years of elbows and the neon sign buzzed like a tired hornet above the windows. It was a Friday evening and the place was full. Farmers still in their boots, truckers in flannel, a couple of families trying to stretch their paychecks into a hot meal. The clatter of plates and low hum of conversation created a fragile peace. The kind of quiet that breaks when people sense something they don't want to look at. The bell above the door jingled, and heads turned before anyone even realized they had. Althea Moore stepped in, adjusting the strap of her worn leather bag on her shoulder. She wasn't dressed to draw attention. Faded jeans, simple black jacket, hair pulled back neatly. Yet the way silence followed her into the room made her stand out more than if she had strutted in covered in diamonds. Her skin alone was enough to mark her as unwelcome in that diner, in that town on that night. She spotted her friend almost immediately. Lauren Mitchell was sitting in a booth at the far end, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug that had long since stopped steaming. Lauren's pale face brightened for a second with relief when she saw Althea, but her eyes darted nervously toward the corner, where a group of men occupied 3 tables pushed together. They weren't just men. They were a pack. Leather vests stitched with snarling skulls, patches glinting under the fluorescent lights, laughter that didn't sound like laughter at all, more like the clinking of knives. Wade Ironjaw Maddox sat among them like a king at court, his bulk filling the chair, a scar splitting his cheek like a permanent sneer. Althea walked to the booth without hesitation, her footsteps steady on the worn linoleum. Lauren leaned forward, voice barely a whisper as she gestured with her eyes toward the bikers. "You sure you want to eat here? We can still go somewhere else." Althea didn't answer right away. She slid into the booth, placed her bag on the seat beside her, and picked up the laminated menu. The words were plain, but her silence carried weight. She wasn't ignoring her friend. She was refusing to acknowledge the warning, because acknowledging it meant surrendering to it. Lauren's fingers tightened around her mug. The moment stretched only seconds before the air split. A voice, deep and laced with mockery, carried across the diner. "Hey, sweetheart. That booth's taken." The room stiffened. Forks paused midair, spoons hovering above bowls. Wade Maddox had turned his chair around, leather creaking under his weight, his gang shifting with him like wolves sniffing fresh blood. Althea raised her eyes, calm and unreadable, meeting his without blinking. "I don't see a reserved sign," she said quietly, as if remarking on the weather. Her tone wasn't sharp, wasn't defensive, it was worse. It was steady, and steady made them furious. A low laugh rolled out of Wade's chest as he pushed himself up, boots echoing across the floor. He walked the distance with the deliberate pace of a predator. Standing over her, his shadow cast across the table, he leaned down so close that the smell of cigarettes and stale beer clung to her skin. "This is a white table. You're in the wrong place, girl." The words dropped like a stone into the diner, sending ripples of discomfort through every corner. A mother near the window pulled her child closer. The cook peered from the pass-through, lips pressed tight. The waitress, Josie Palmer, froze in the middle of pouring coffee, her hand trembling, hot liquid spilling onto the counter unnoticed. Everyone saw. No one moved. Lauren swallowed hard, shrinking back against the wall of the booth. "Althea, maybe we should dash," she started, her voice shaking. But Wade's fist came down on the table with a crack that rattled the glasses and sent silverware clattering. "Did you not hear me?" His voice boomed over the muted diner. "Get your black ass up before I drag you out myself." Gasps echoed, murmurs rising and falling like waves. A trucker at the counter shifted uncomfortably but didn't stand. 2 teenagers whispered but quickly looked away when one of Wade's men glared in their direction. Fear was thick in the air. Not just fear of violence but fear of being the next target if anyone dared intervene. Althea's face didn't change. She reached for the glass of water in front of her, lifted it, and took a slow sip. The deliberate calmness was more defiant than any shouted protest could have been. Wade's nostrils flared, rage building behind his eyes at her refusal to give him the satisfaction of trembling. He leaned even closer, his voice now a growl that only she and Lauren could hear. "Say yes, sir. Maybe then I let you walk out of here with your teeth still in your mouth." The gang behind him erupted in laughter, slapping tables, their voices harsh and jeering. One slid into the booth beside Lauren, pressing her further into the corner. She whimpered, whispering to Althea, "Please just go." But Althea set down her glass with precise calm, wiped her hands on the thin napkin, and folded it neatly beside her plate. Every movement was slow, deliberate, controlled. Her stillness was louder than any shout. Wade mistook it for fear, but it wasn't fear. It was restraint, a kind of control most men like him never recognized until it was too late. The diner held its breath, the neon buzzing like an anxious pulse, the smell of fried onions heavy in the air. Wade's finger jabbed inches from her face, his tattoos twisting with the motion. "Last chance," he hissed, his voice sharp enough to cut. "You walk out of here on your feet, or you crawl out through that door." Althea finally lifted her eyes fully to his, her gaze unflinching, steady as stone. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, yet it cut through the thick silence of the diner with frightening clarity. "You're making a mistake." The laughter from the gang grew louder, rolling through the diner like thunder. Wade grinned wider, mistaking her calm for surrender. But the people watching, the cook, the waitress, the families frozen in their booths, they felt it. Something in her tone, something in her eyes, suggested the storm hadn't begun yet. And when it did, none of them would forget it. The laughter rolled across the diner like a wave of broken glass, cutting through every corner. It rattled in the air vents, hung in the grease-stained lights, and sank into the bones of those who sat silent, pretending their food was more important than what was happening only a few feet away. Lauren's hands were trembling so badly her mug clinked against the saucer, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the hush that followed Wade Maddox's last words. He stood there looming, his scar catching the neon glow, his voice thick with the arrogance of a man who had always gotten his way. Althea Moore, however, sat like stone. Calm. Collected. Her silence felt heavier than his threats. It was the kind of calm that frightened more than shouting, the kind that made a person wonder what she knew that he didn't. Wade mistook it for submission, a mistake that would cost him, but the people watching didn't. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, because they recognized something they couldn't name in her stillness. Lauren finally dared to look at her friend. She had never seen Althea this way, eyes sharp but steady, face unreadable, her breathing even. Lauren remembered nights when Althea stayed after their late shifts at the hospital, when she talked about helping her elderly neighbors, when she laughed softly about the old Ford truck that broke down every other week. She looked like any other woman trying to get by in a small town that wasn't always kind. But Lauren also remembered glimpses, flashes she had never pressed on. The way Althea's posture never slouched, the scars that disappeared under her sleeve, the way her gaze could harden without warning. None of that had made sense to Lauren before. Tonight it began to. The gang around Wade shifted, their boots squealing against the tile, their leather vests brushing as they leaned in closer. They wanted a show. They wanted blood. One of them, a wiry blonde with a chain at his belt, shoved himself into the booth beside Lauren, his shoulder pressing her against the wall. His grin was sharp as broken teeth. "You picked the wrong friend, darling," he whispered into her ear, and the tears that had been pooling finally spilled down Lauren's cheeks. She pressed her hands against the edge of the table, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. Josie Palmer, the waitress, stood frozen at the counter, her order pad clutched to her chest. Her heart pounded so hard she thought the bikers might hear it, but her feet wouldn't move. She knew Wade. Everyone in town knew Wade. He had run people off roads, smashed car windows, and broken bones for less than a sideways glance. The sheriff had turned a blind eye more than once. Josie bit her lip so hard it bled, her eyes flicking between the phone under the counter and the menacing scene unfolding in front of her. Should she call? Would they notice? Wade slammed his fist down again, hard enough that water jumped from the glasses and silverware clattered. He leaned in until Althea could feel the spit on her cheek. "You deaf or just stupid?" he snarled. "Say it. Say you don't belong and maybe I'll let you crawl out of here alive." His words dripped with poison, each syllable designed to humiliate her, to make the entire diner complicit in her degradation. Still, Althea didn't move. She reached for her napkin, wiped the drops of water from the table with slow precision, and set it neatly aside. The act was maddening, infuriating in its quiet refusal. Wade's jaw clenched, the veins in his neck bulging as the gang chuckled behind him, eager for the moment they thought was coming. Inside Althea, memory stirred, not chaotic, not panicked, but disciplined and exact. Sandstorms in Kandahar, the rattle of machine fire, the bark of instructors on the training yard, the weight of exhausted men leaning on her during midnight marches. She remembered carrying more than her own pack because someone else had fallen. She remembered the silence of nights when the stars felt close enough to touch, when the only thing keeping her alive was the rhythm of her breath. She had been taught to keep calm when everything screamed to panic. That training was stitched into her like a second skin, invisible to the eyes of men like Wade, but unshakable nonetheless. Lauren's quiet plea cut into the silence. "Please, Althea, don't just stand up. Please." Her voice cracked, and in that moment she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone in the diner, everyone too afraid to rise, everyone too used to lowering their eyes. Wade leaned even closer, his finger jabbing toward Althea's chest. "Last chance," he hissed, the words thick with promise. "You walk out of here or you crawl out through that door." The room itself seemed to shrink around them, the smell of grease heavy, the neon light buzzing louder as if straining to hear her answer. Even Josie, her hand shaking under the counter, dared to slide her fingers toward the phone at last, her breath catching in her throat. Althea lifted her gaze, steady and sharp, not rushed, not shaken. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You're making a mistake," she said again, softer this time, but the words carved deeper, carried further. And though Wade's gang roared with laughter, though Lauren's tears spilled faster, though Josie's hand trembled over the buttons of the phone, something in the diner shifted. It was the kind of moment no one could explain, but everyone felt the beat before a storm breaks, the hush before lightning cracks. And when it did, it would split the night wide open. The sound of laughter clattered through the diner like cutlery falling to the floor, sharp and mocking, a chorus that made the air thick with cruelty. Wade Maddox stood above Althea, his grin carved with arrogance, his gang feeding off his every word. Lauren sat trapped, pressed against the booth wall by the wiry blonde biker whose grin widened with each tear that slid down her cheek. Josie Palmer stood frozen behind the counter, her hand hovering over the phone, her mind warring between fear and duty. The room smelled of coffee and grease, but under it all was something heavier, the weight of hate pressing down until no one dared to breathe too loud. Althea's stillness cut through it all. She sat with her back straight, her shoulders squared, her breathing calm, as though the chaos around her did not belong to her world. Wade's finger jabbed once more toward her chest, his tattoos writhing in the flicker of neon light. "Say it," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "Say you don't belong here. Crawl out on your knees, and maybe I'll let you go with just bruises." The words fell heavy, designed to strip dignity from bone, to crush spirit before body. But Althea did not bow. She raised her eyes, steady and cutting, and for a moment something in Wade faltered, though he covered it quickly with another sneer. The silence cracked when Wade's hand shot forward, his fingers clamping around Althea's arm. The contact was rough, demanding, his grip meant to humiliate as much as restrain. The sound of glass rattling on the table rang through the room, and Lauren gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The gang howled louder, slapping the backs of chairs, boots thudding against tile as they anticipated the spectacle. But what came next was not what they expected. Althea rose. Not fast, not violent, she rose with a deliberate calm that sent a ripple through the diner. The scrape of her chair against the tile echoed like thunder, sharp and final. She stood taller than anyone had noticed before, her spine unbending, her gaze level and unshaken. Wade tightened his grip, prepared to yank her toward the floor, but her body shifted in a way he couldn't anticipate. With one sharp, precise twist, she broke his hold as if it were nothing. The crack of joints strained echoed in the air, and Wade stumbled a half-step back, shock flashing across his scarred face. The diner's silence deepened, the only sound the faint hum of neon and the thud of Wade's boots as he regained balance. His gang's laughter faltered, uncertainty creeping into their jeers. Lauren's tears stilled on her cheeks, her wide eyes glued to Althea as though seeing her for the first time. Josie's hand clutched the phone tighter, her breath stuck in her chest. Everyone in that room knew something had shifted, that the woman they thought was cornered was anything but. Wade snarled, fury sparking hot in his eyes. "You think you're tough?" he spat, lunging forward with his other hand curled into a fist. The diner gasped as he swung, but Althea moved like water, swift and efficient. She ducked under the blow, hooked his wrist, and in one fluid motion sent his bulk crashing chest first against the edge of the counter. Plates rattled, silverware clinked, and a ketchup bottle toppled, bursting red across the floor. Wade groaned, the air knocked from his lungs, his face twisted in shock as much as pain. The blonde biker who had pinned Lauren moved next, his fist swinging wild toward Althea's face. She turned, catching his momentum, twisting his arm and flinging him across the table with a force that cracked wood and sent plates flying. Lauren scrambled free, pressing herself against the wall, her breath heaving in short bursts. "Oh my God!" she whispered, her voice trembling, half in fear, half in awe. Another biker charged, boots pounding against tile. Althea sidestepped, her body turning with the grace of someone who had rehearsed every movement 1,000 times. Her knee snapped up into his shin, her arm locking around his neck just long enough to slam him to the ground with controlled precision. He gasped, stunned but alive. Every move she made was exact, not one wasted, not one cruel. She fought not to destroy but to control, to end the violence without feeding it further. That was what made it terrifying. The gang hesitated now, their laughter gone, their jeers silenced. They watched their leader stumble, their brothers sprawled across the diner floor. The diners who had once looked away now leaned forward, eyes wide, hearts racing. Phones began to lift, hands trembling as they pressed record, not for spectacle but for evidence, proof that something extraordinary was happening. Wade staggered upright, fury burning hotter than shame. His hand went to his belt, fingers curling around the handle of a knife. The sight of it drew gasps, a scream from a mother clutching her child in the corner. Lauren's voice cracked as she cried out, "Althea!" Josie dropped the phone from her shaking hands, the call to 911 already made, her knuckles white against the counter. The moment stretched tight, brittle as glass. Wade's blade caught the neon light, his teeth bared in rage. "You're dead," he hissed, his voice breaking through clenched teeth. But Althea didn't flinch. She stood steady, her eyes locked on his, her hands at her sides, calm as a soldier awaiting command. The fear that had filled the diner moments before shifted, turning to something else: anticipation. Awe, the growing certainty that the storm had only just begun. The diner seemed to shrink as Wade Maddox drew the knife, its steel edge catching the glow of the neon sign that buzzed overhead. For a heartbeat, the entire room held its breath, the clinking of silverware and low chatter that once filled the space gone as if erased. All that remained was the sound of Lauren's sharp inhale and the soft creak of leather as Wade's gang leaned forward, eager for violence. Althea Moore stood in the center of it, not hunched, not trembling, but tall and steady, her hands relaxed at her sides. Her face was calm, her eyes unwavering, and in that calm there was a weight that unsettled everyone watching. Wade mistook it for weakness, just as he had before, but the silence pressing against the diner's walls said otherwise. Wade lunged, his knife hand flashing forward with reckless fury. The mothers in the corner gasped, the trucker at the counter stiffened, and Lauren's scream cut through the air. But Althea's body moved with a speed and precision that none of them had ever seen. She caught Wade's wrist mid-swing, twisted sharply, and the knife clattered harmlessly to the floor. The sound of metal against tile was louder than any shout, a sharp punctuation that left the room stunned. Wade staggered, his face twisting in disbelief as Althea shoved him back into the booth with a force that made the wooden frame groan. Gasps rippled through the diner. The gang froze, unsure if they had just seen what they thought they saw. One of them swore under his breath, his bravado cracking. Lauren pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide and wet, her hand trembling over her mouth as she tried to steady her breathing. Josie Palmer, finally gathering courage, darted from behind the counter, snatching the knife up with shaking fingers and tossing it onto the counter far out of reach. Her face was pale but her jaw was clenched, as if her own fear had turned into something harder the longer she watched. Althea's hands moved slowly now, deliberate as she reached into the back pocket of her jeans. The gang tensed, expecting a weapon, But instead she pulled out a worn leather wallet. She flipped it open and held it out for all to see. Inside gleamed a United States Marine Corps identification card, edges laminated and worn from years of service. Next to it, a commendation card, shining faintly under the diner lights. The reflection flickered across Wade's stunned face, silencing even the most defiant of his men. Her voice cut through the silence, low and steady, carrying the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers under fire. "My name is Captain Althea Moore, United States Marine Corps, retired. 12 years of service, 3 combat tours. And you just threatened a decorated veteran." Her words hung in the air, each one heavier than the last, and the silence that followed was absolute. The diners who had cowered in silence now sat transfixed. A woman at the counter covered her mouth, tears spilling over her cheeks. A teenage busboy whispered, "She's a Marine," as if saying it aloud would make it more real. Lauren blinked through her tears, her fear shifting into something else: relief, pride, awe. Josie's trembling finally stilled as she clutched the phone to her chest. Wade's face lost its color. The bravado that had fueled him drained away as his eyes darted between the ID card and the woman who held it. His mouth opened but no words came. Behind him, the men who had laughed moments ago shifted uneasily, their shoulders slumping, the sneers slipping from their faces. The weight of her words pressed down on them harder than any fist. Althea's gaze swept across the gang, sharp and commanding. "On your knees. Hands behind your heads." It wasn't shouted. Didn't need to be. The tone was unmistakable. It was an order, the kind that came from years of leading men in life or death moments, the kind that broke through ego and arrogance and left only obedience. Something in her voice cracked the gang's resistance. One by one they hesitated, then lowered themselves to their knees, fumbling to lace their hands behind their heads. Their leather vests creaked, their boots scuffed against the tile, but not one of them dared defy her. "Use your belts," she instructed, her tone still even, still calm. "Tie your wrists." Her voice carried the same weight as before, and though their faces burned with humiliation, they obeyed. They stripped their belts from their jeans, leather snapping in their hands as they cinched their own wrists tight. The sight was surreal. Men who had minutes ago boasted and threatened now reduced to silence, bound by their own hands, subdued not by fists but by authority they couldn't comprehend. The diners began to murmur, the fear that had held them hostage giving way to something new. Respect, admiration, even shame that they had not spoken sooner. A few pulled out phones, not with the eagerness of bystanders hungry for spectacle, but with the reverence of witnesses who knew this night would need to be remembered. Althea lowered her wallet, tucking it back into her pocket. She looked at Wade, who knelt in front of her, his scarred face glistening with sweat, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. She crouched slightly so her gaze was level with his. Her voice dropped into something softer, yet every word landed heavy. "You thought I was weak because of my skin, because I was quiet, because you believe this place belongs to you. Doesn't. Not anymore." Wade swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his brow. His lips quivered as he tried to form words, but nothing came out. Behind him, his men stared at the floor, their arrogance broken, their silence louder than their earlier jeers. The neon light buzzed faintly above, the smell of grease heavy in the air, but the diner no longer felt like the same place. It had become a courtroom, a battlefield, a lesson. Althea's presence had rewritten the room, and every person there knew they would never forget it. The belts creaked as they tightened, leather cutting into the wrists of men who had moments ago laughed so loud the diner shook. Now they were silent, kneeling, their pride shattered against the tile floor. The room was no longer thick with hate. It was heavy with disbelief, awe, and the echo of Althea Moore's voice that still seemed to hum in the neon light above. Lauren clutched the edge of the booth, her breathing uneven, tears streaking her face not from fear now but from relief. She looked at her friend as if seeing her for the first time. As if the woman who had quietly shared night shifts and tired jokes had transformed into someone untouchable, someone larger than life. Josie Palmer pressed her phone to her chest, whispering into the receiver that police were on their way, her voice breaking with emotion as she said, "She saved us all." The sirens arrived first as a distant wail, growing louder with each passing second until red and blue lights spilled through the diner windows, painting the walls in restless color. The sound of car doors slamming outside jolted the air, And a moment later 2 officers stepped in, hands hovering near their holsters as their eyes swept across the frozen scene. What they found was not the chaos they expected but a sight that rooted them to the floor. 10 bikers knelt in a row, wrists bound by their own belts, heads lowered. And in the center of it all stood Althea, tall and steady, her face calm as if she had simply been waiting for them. Josie pointed with a trembling hand, her voice cracking. Those men attacked her. She stopped them. The officers exchanged a look, then turned back to the gang, then to Althea. She reached slowly into her pocket, pulled out her wallet again and handed it over. Her voice carried steady and clear. Captain Althea Moore, United States Marine Corps, retired. These men attempted assault with a deadly weapon. You'll find the knife on the counter. You also have more than a dozen witnesses. The officer who took her ID straightened, his tone shifting to one of sharp respect. Understood, Captain. We'll take it from here. One by one, the bikers were lifted from their knees, their wrists cuffed properly. Wade Maddox tried to keep his eyes on the floor, but once, just once, he glanced at Althea. There was no fight left in his gaze, only shame, the raw sting of a man who had been broken not by fists but by dignity he could never match. She met his glance only briefly, her expression unreadable, then turned away. The diner erupted into quiet murmurs, then into soft clapping that grew into something more. It wasn't applause for a spectacle. It was gratitude, admiration, the sound of people who had been too afraid to stand but were now grateful someone had. A woman at the counter wiped her eyes and whispered, "She's a hero." The young busboy nodded quickly, his voice almost a prayer. She saved her friend. She saved all of us. Lauren finally pushed herself from the booth, her knees trembling as she crossed to Althea's side. She gripped her friend's arm with both hands, holding on as though afraid she would disappear. "You didn't even flinch," she whispered through tears. Althea placed a steady hand on her shoulder, her voice quiet but certain. "Combat teaches you to stay calm. Hate teaches you to stand tall." Her words carried across the room, reaching ears that would never forget them. As the last of the bikers were escorted out under flashing lights, the diner seemed to exhale. People who had sat silent now rose, nodding in respect, some offering soft words of thanks. Althea only nodded back, her face still calm, though her eyes carried the weight of everything unspoken. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a few bills and laid them on the table for Josie. Even in the ruins of smashed plates and scattered food, she chose dignity, paying for the meal she hadn't touched. Then she turned to the small crowd, her voice rising one last time. "The next time you see someone treated like they're less, remember tonight. It costs nothing to stand up, but it can cost everything to stay silent." The words landed like stone, heavy and permanent, etched into the hearts of those who heard them. A few heads bowed, others nodded, tears falling freely now. For some, shame lingered. For others, resolve began to take root. Outside, the police cars pulled away, their sirens fading into the distance, leaving only the hum of neon and the smell of grease behind. Althea guided Lauren toward the door, her steps unhurried. The cool night air hit them as they stepped outside, the sky above wide and silent. Lauren wiped at her cheeks, her voice fragile. "How did you stay so calm, even when he pulled the knife?" Althea paused, her gaze lifting to the stars overhead. For a moment, her eyes softened, touched by memory and the weight of a past few in that town could imagine. "Because I already fought for my country," she said. "I'm not about to bow to a diner." The old Ford truck rumbled to life as she opened the door, its engine coughing before settling into a steady growl. Lauren slid in beside her, still shaken but safe. The neon lights flickered in the reflection of the windshield as Althea shifted the truck into gear. The diner grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the weight of her words lingered inside it, heavy and unshakable. Those who had been silent now carried something they couldn't forget. Some would carry shame. Others would carry courage. But none would ever forget the night a woman they underestimated stood taller than a gang of men and turned hate into silence. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and share it so more people can hear it. Make sure to subscribe, because we bring you real stories that prove courage still exists in the world. And tell us in the comments, if you had been sitting in that diner, would you have stayed silent like everyone else, or would you have stood up beside her? We'd love to know your thoughts.